Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Death by Adaptation podcast, a bi-weekly book club where we choose one classic book and compare and contrast it against its cinematic adaptations. I'm your host, Nicolò Grasso, and I'm joined, as always, by the great Ewan Gleadow. How are you doing, Ewan?
Me, tired, stressed, but good. I'm doing good. I'm all right. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm doing very, very well. We're 2 weeks into the year as time of recording, and you know, lots of surprises have popped up in my life. Some good experiences will arrive in the coming months, but also we have this podcast that keeps us going. It's so much fun every time just reading books. I've completely destroyed my presence on social media at this point. Outside of Twitter and like the rare Instagram story, every time I'm like somewhere where I'm tempted to open a social media, especially like TikTok, I'm just like, nope, I'm gonna open like Libby or Read or like whatever to just read a little bit. And so this way, every time I would have spent like 20 minutes watching you TikTok videos, and I'm just reading Kafka or something.
I
Ah,
saw you read Metamorphoses,
yes.
but I don't have the TikTok. I don't really get it. I got my head around Twitter and Instagram. That'll do me. But yeah, I'm kind of in the same boat where I've started putting my phone in a desk because if
Mm,
it's out, and then I'll just stare at my WordPress stats instead of reading. But
yeah,
yeah,
it's
just
addictive.
gotta. It's awful. Speaking of addictions,
Speaking of addictions,
hey, brilliant,
perfect segue because
fantastic.
2 weeks ago we decided to start off the year on a lighter note. It was the end of the holidays. We were still like our mind was still on vacation. So we talked about Die Hard and Nothing Lasts Forever, which was a very very fun episode. Our good friend Randy Burrows joined us. Also featuring a cameo by Jakob Flash of the Uncle James podcast. But today we're going back into our let's say darker side of things, taking a serious-ish novel for a slightly less serious film. Because today we're talking about Irvine Welsh's Trainspotting.
Choose life. Choose a job. Choose a career. Choose a family. Choose a fucking big television. Choose washing machines, cars, compact disc players and electrical tin openers. Choose good health, low cholesterol and dental insurance. Choose fixed interest mortgage repayments. Choose a starter home. Choose your friends. Choose leisure wear and matching luggage. Choose a three-piece suite on hire purchase and a range of fucking fabrics. Choose DIY and wondering who the fuck you are on a Sunday morning. Choose sitting on that couch watching mind-numbing, spirit-crushing game shows, stuffing fucking junk food into your mouth. Choose rotting away at the end of it all, pissing your last in a miserable home, nothing more than an embarrassment to the selfish, fucked-up brats that you've spawned to replace yourselves. Choose your future. Choose life.
Trainspotting is a 1993 novel by Irvine Welsh. Irvine Welsh, a Scottish writer we've talked about him previously, actually, last year, where we read Filth, one of his other more acclaimed books. But Trainspotting came early in his career and it absolutely skyrocketed him as one of the more interesting voices of the time. Because one of the key features of Welsh's writing is his way of just transporting readers into the world that he has inhabited for many many years. You feel like you're in Scotland, and everything is written in this like everything is written in this heavy Scottish dialect, where it's so off-putting at first, but after a while you're just thinking in Scottish. It completely rewires your brain for a few days while you're reading Trainspotting. It's incredible. But of course, most of you who are listening likely have read the book or at least have watched the movie, so you know that Trainspotting is a bit of a slice of life story in a way. It's about a group of young men in Scotland, in Edinburgh, who are addicts. They're addicted to a lot of drugs, and they try to stop their addictions. They try to confront it. They constantly fail. Life beats them down. They beat themselves down. But hopefully, there's a bit of redemption at the end. Who knows? It's an Irvine Welsh story. It could go either way. Ewan, what are your
Hello.
thoughts with Trainspotting, the book?
Oh
And this
man.
was not your first time reading it,
This,
right?
no, this is my second time reading it.
Mm,
I much preferred the second read to the one I did about 3 years ago. Because I'm a massive fan of Filth, and I remember I pitched Filth for one of the podcast episodes we did last year.
yeah.
A lot of fun, a lot of filth, a lot of misery. And it was more or less the same for Trainspotting, but Trainspotting for me is incredible. It's absolutely phenomenal. I think more so because I've kind of lived near to Scotland and have got
Mm,
friends that were from there, and a lot of the colloquialisms, which the book is essentially written like the Scottish dialect, kind of just felt comfy to me. Although the scenarios and the settings are anything but, and it felt really warm, oddly enough. Um, it's
interesting.
a real book of complete depravity and just absolute horror show stuff. And those are kind of the books that I'm attracted to most. I think I like American Psycho, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, Filth.
Mm,
I just like degradation stuff like Junkie from William Burroughs. It's up my street because I know I'll never have to experience that, but at the same time, I've kind of seen it, and to read it, especially with Trainspotting and sort of vignette style it's got going for
mm.
itself. Oh, it's delightful. It really is a treat. And I was wondering how you cracked on with it because it is quite colloquial. It is quite Scottish, and there's a couple in there that are like Scottish rhyming slang, like Lee Marvin for starving and stuff. I love stuff like
Gotta dust off the good old dictionary and just be like English to Scottish and vice versa. Surprisingly enough, it wasn't that big of a deal for me. I mean, the first chapter is like, oh my god, not this again, because we did it with Filth, and Filth was, I want to say, maybe easier to read, despite still
yeah.
having a
Oh
lot
yeah.
of those, a lot of the heavy Scottish writing, because it's like the way it's written, it's almost like you would pronounce it. It's very, very interesting. I love this style. Um, but Trainspotting is harder in that sense, but also, I knew what I was in for this time around. I braced myself, and the impact was relatively soft. I really enjoyed this. Really, really, really enjoyed this, despite making me feel absolute, like just like shit. didn't feel didn't feel good to read this book. It's one of those things that Irvine Welsh is very interested in the darkness of humanity, and while in Filth we were focusing on a cop. So the pigs, you could say, all of the various corruption of power. Here you're seeing the working class, like the poorest of the poor, pretty much. The people who are exploited by the system that someone like the cop from Fields would enforce. And there is a lot of frustration. There is a lot of anger. This was written, a lot of the evils that good old Margaret Thatcher did were still very, very present in Scotland, especially. And there's a lot of anger, a lot of frustration coming through in Welsh's writing. There's a lot of humor as well, though not nearly as prevalent as in the film, you could say. And it goes to some places that we'll touch on as well. Just in general, people, content warning. there's there's a lot of messed up things happening in this book, from abortions, death of infants, rape, lots of poop and vomit and semen and other bodily fluids and explicit sexual acts and violence. So if any of that bothers you, this is not the book nor film for you. Um, but what you mentioned, there was the vignette structure, like this succession of vignettes was what fascinated me, because it's not a very linear story at all, dare I say, because it keeps jumping from character to character. You have the four main ones that you follow, that are also known from the movie. You have Renton, you have Spud, you have Sick Boy, you have Bigby. You also have Tommy and a couple of other people, even some female characters that are followed around as, I don't know, as they're tending at a bar or working at a restaurant, or where they have to go to some job interview or things like that. What did you think about this structure, and just the way it presents, like the way Irvine Welsh presents characters and makes you learn about them from a first person perspective? Because I think every single chapter is in first person as well.
Yeah, I think pretty much all of them
Mm,
are. No, I really like it because it gives you the chance to see it, like you said, through his eyes. You get to see the people that sort of occupy the streets, his experiences with people. But at the same time, it does really well to sort of grow that area. It's Leith, it's heroin, it's drugs, it's a lot of dingy stuff. But at the core of that is real people, and I think
mhm.
that's the absolute key to that sort of structure where it's you can pick that up, read a couple of pages, and you've basically completed one of the stories. You've read thoroughly one character or one moment within a character if they're a bigger lead like Renton or Spud, and a lot of it really helps with the world building on the whole, where the characters start to cross over, which is something Welsh started doing with his later works. Like Begbie gets a name mentioned in Filth, somebody
Mm-hmm.
gets another mention in Marabou Stark Night. It all crosses over in such a non-committed way that it makes it feel like a natural world that's evolving. It's independent yet completely linked, and it's a very strange structure, and I don't think it would work if it weren't for the vignette style.
Mm-hmm.
And having said that, it again, it's that singularity but connectivity also, where it's those vignettes are independent moments that somehow manage to feature the same characters who grow, but at the same time stay identical to one another by the very first page. It's like
Yeah.
Renton is still sort of masterminding his own problems around mortality and what to do with it, which I think reading it this year for me was right on the money. That was absolutely haunting because it is about, I mean, fundamentally for me, Trainspotting is about upping sticks, leaving somewhere that doesn't benefit you. And I find myself doing that now, where it's like I'm trying to move, I'm trying to leave my hometown, which has no benefit to me. I felt very much like Renton without the heroin, and it's awful, it's terrifying. So I completely like I just fell in love with it all over again. I felt real sympathy for Renton. I felt real sympathy for people like Spud and Sick Boy, who were kind of expanded a bit more in the later books and the later film, especially the sequel, which I'm sure we'll touch on briefly.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, even Begbie, out of all people, who's like this just scummy, horrible guy. I've seen Begbie types. I think everybody knows a Begbie. If they're in the UK, they've seen it down the pub, and I have as well. And I'm not saying it makes me feel sort of upset for those people or kind of touched by them, but I kind of understand the mentality that they've got now because there's such a sort of standard set. And Welsh does really well to explore that. There's a lot of other stuff that he explores as well. I think that one of the great comparisons with this is American Psycho and how it deals with
Mm-hmm.
the AIDS crisis. But on
Oh
top of
yeah.
that, there's a lot of, again, it's because a lot of my friends are football fans that support Celtic and stuff. Seeing the sectarianism between Hibs and Hearts is, it's Celtic Rangers, but a little lower down. And seeing that through the perspective of Hearts fans, Hibs fans, and a neutral in Welsh's writing gives a lot of perspective to sort of the football hooliganism angle. And to be fair, it probably helps that I've just watched The Firm with Gary Oldman, where it was very brutal, very bloody. It's been a real weird start of the year where I've just watched a lot of violent films and read a lot of violent books, and now I'm reading one about a bookshop seller. Um,
Oh,
but no, I think it really does well. I mean, you've got like characters that are in for one segment. I think the best one is the one that features Alan Venters, the guy that he meets at the AIDS support group, which is
that's a memorable sequence. Yes.
utterly brutal because it all of a sudden just switches it. It drops all the colloquial dialect and goes for a straight shooting story.
Mm.
And the impact of that is incredible. It's phenomenal. I mean, it's a testament to Welsh's writing that he's managed to make something really grim, really upsetting, feel really homely and very sort of, oh, I've seen that person before, or I see myself in that person, which is terrifying to think when you're looking at people who are, on a bus to London shooting heroin up in a toilet. It's never good to see yourself in people like that. But
That's
I
yeah.
think it's part of the humanism of it as well, where it's, beyond that layer of these people are junkies, that underneath that is these people are human. And I
Mhm.
think establishing that and making sure it's constant throughout is really important. It really helps sort of connect with those characters, knowing that they're trying at least to get off, like especially Renton and Sick Boy. I think they're the two sort of parallels that come up quite a lot, and it's
Mhm.
really powerful stuff. It really terrified me.
It's haunting. It's properly haunting. I think especially speaking of the cycle of addiction that's present in the book, it's definitely primarily, of course, about drugs and that type of
Yeah,
addiction. But there are so many other things that keep drawing these people into doing, I don't know, maybe sometimes it's crime. Like they're incapable of getting a proper job, so they have to resort to stealing and
yeah,
thieving and creating scams. Otherwise they're obsessed with getting laid, and so there's always this constant pursuit of a girl that's going to have sex with them. Or otherwise it's even like you mentioned actually very powerfully, um, just how addictive staying in the same place can be. Like it's completely keeping you from breathing and from living your fullest life.
Yeah.
It's a chokehold that's stopping people like Renton, for instance. We could say not necessarily the protagonist, but yeah, like you said, one of the key characters of the book.
Yeah.
You feel so much for him, and that's, like you mentioned as well, the power of Welsh's writing. There's a lot of empathy. It doesn't justify any of the actions that these people do, and there are some horrible actions,
Oh yeah.
but it feels so real, so true to life, despite being, of course, exaggerated and sometimes comedic and tragicomic. It's so touching, even.
Yeah.
There are especially the moments of desperation where you can see someone who's, I don't know, like Renton going to London, managing to kind of distance himself from his friends. And there's the feeling of like, yeah, I like staying with these people, but also, why am I staying with them? Should I keep on staying with them? Because actually, I'm doing far better now that I'm away from them than I was when I was staying in Edinburgh. And oh, it does hit close to home,
It does. Yeah.
um, which I was not expecting, considering, the basis of everything is those are
Yeah.
drug addicts.
I think that's the infectious quality of Welsh, though, is that he manages to
Mm,
make. I mean, Marabou Stalk Nights, for instance, that's such a fascinating book, but it speaks a lot about sort of patriotism in Scotland. And Phil, for instance, that's so layered, but it's also about childhood trauma, and
yeah.
it all stems from something that's very creative, very interesting. It's fundamentally Irvine Welsh is a fiction writer. He wants to write the most interesting story he can with the tools available. But underneath all that is a real quality that I can't find in many other writers, where it's so fundamentally personal, yet just connects in that just ease. I mean, again, that Renton stuff where he's trying to move on, he's trying to move out. I get that. I get that completely. I mean, even today, it's kind of like I just feel like cabin fever setting in because
Mm,
all I do is work. I finish work and then there's nowhere to go because there's nothing to do in this shithole town. But the fact that he's trying to move and then sort of questioning why he bothered staying, that's where I'm at the moment. So hearing all of that processed in the book, regardless of whether or not it's a heroin addict or a scholar, doesn't matter who it is, what is
mm,
there is a fundamental that has been adapted to a character. I think a lot of it says a lot about sort of the setting someone can find themselves in, whether or not they're comfortable, whether or not they're sort of dossing about waiting for their next hit of skag. Either way, these characters have aspirations, and it's always been a fundamental. Everybody has an aspiration. Your aspiration is not to do something mundane, and Welsh really captures that. He really gets to the gritty bare bones of some people will aspire to what they want to do, some people will not,
mhm.
and you get to see that through Tommy. You get to see that through Venner's. You get to see it through Ventus. Sorry, not Venner's. I don't know where I got Venner's from. But you get to see it through a lot. I mean, there's a Diane, obviously. There's Kelly. There's
Yeah.
all these characters just building and building, building, and it's amazing how layered it is. Like I don't know where to start because there's so much to Welsh's writing where he's adapting one thing, he's understanding another, he's taking a third topic altogether and putting it in there. And it just flows naturally because it feels like real people. And I'm hoping that continues for the rest of the series. I've got Porno on my desk now, the book, not just a
Hey,
generic, like
just in general.
yeah. No, I've got Porno. I've got a nice copy that they released just before the second film came out. But then I've got
Oh, nice.
Blade Artist. I've got Glue. I've got the Acid House because it's just a treasure trove of people that are fundamentally tackling something that other people are tackling in the real world, and it's a testament to the quality of Trainspotting that a book where every other page is an act of graphic violence, drug
Hmm.
addiction, or horror can connect so fundamentally to the soul, to the actual thoughts of, oh my god, I've got to do something, I've got to sort myself out, I've got to move on to that next step of my life, otherwise I'm going to end up like these characters or somewhere in between, and I don't know what would be worse. But
Yeah.
yeah.
I wonder if this was a wake up call for some people,
Mm.
just reading Trainspotting, maybe seeing themselves in it.
It certainly was for me, especially on
Hmm.
the second run through, where it's the back and forth he has, where he's in London and then he's back in Edinburgh and he's back in London, and you can just start to see that shift. It's like you've got to be addicted to something. I do so much work. I think I'm pretty fair. It's fair to say I'm probably a workaholic.
Hmm.
But when I was at uni, it was just you would go out, you would go drinking. It was that all the time, constantly. So it's just a shift in focus. You can't not be addicted to something. And if you're not addicted to something, you're probably quite a boring person. You've got to have that fundamental focus where you are doing that all the time. And it's that shift that Welsh has for Renton, where he's on the train to London, he's sort of getting invested in the real estate business. He's actually finding interest. And it's towards the end when he says, "Oh, I did another shot of heroin, but it felt numb, it felt boring. It wasn't the addiction he needed anymore," because people outgrow addiction sometimes. People will see something and go, "You know what, that's it. I've had my fill. Time to find something else." And it really is just so strong. Currently, I'm addicted to trying to move to a port city. But, I think until I've got something else to get addicted to, like French wine or like collecting records, that'll have to sit,
Especially collecting French wine. That's an expensive hobby.
Oh man, I made bolognese yesterday and I tipped a little too much wine into it. It was essentially just a bowl of wine with some mince in it. Jesus, it was horrible.
It's not boiling water,
strong.
it's boiling wine.
Oh, man, it was horrible. What was that thing I drank in Venice? That really strong stuff.
The Campari.
Yeah, that was horrifying. It was like I had a bottle of Campari poured into me bolognese.
That's like a recipe I have to write down right now and try.
Man. No. Please do not try that. Do not try this at home. It's like a jackass stunt gone wrong, that meal. Good grief. I'm pretty sure half the heroin addicts in Trainspotting would have turned their nose up at that.
That's the new kick they need. It's like, oh yeah, just dropping wine in pasta. Yeah. That's what I'm gonna do right now to get high.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's impressive. It's properly impressive.
Yeah.
The way you understand these people. There's a clear. There's an element of self-awareness. I don't know anything about Irvine Welsh's, personal life, whether he actually had some of these experiences personally, if he saw them in close friends and relatives, or if he just saw them as a third party, just oh, this is happening around me, and I'm just witnessing it from afar. But there is a strong element of self-awareness in this book that I think really captures what makes addictions so scary. And that's another thing that I really liked about this book. There's no glamorizing it. Of course, you're reading it from the perspective of an addict. And so at first they talk about, it's like, think about the best orgasm you've ever had multiplied by 1,000. And it's still nowhere near as good as this feels. But you also see all of the dangerous consequences. You see how much money they keep spending, how they neglect various parts of their life, leading also to one of the more disturbing parts where an infant dies because they've been just high. The various people at this drug den, they've been high for so many hours, maybe even days, God knows, and they've completely forgotten to tend to a child. And it goes to these very dark places that I think also come from some personal experience, and that's something that I've seen as well from other people, like the idea that you are in full control of your addiction, of your problem. It's like the thing of, oh yeah, I saw it with some people when I was studying in the UK, for instance. Like, yeah, no, I don't have a drinking problem. See, I can go like 2-3 days without drinking. See, I'm doing fine. Then the fourth day they get completely wasted. And it's like, but are you in control? No, but I wanted to do it. Did you? And it becomes this thin line, and there are so many parts in the book that are like this. They're like, yeah, I don't really need to do. I can stop for a couple of days, maybe 3-4 days, and then I kind of need a hit. But it's just the one. It's just the one. I'm not gonna spend the entire day. I'm just gonna take a lighter drug because I'm in control. That's what's very scary to me about drugs, but also just addictions in general, of course. And that's what really resonated with me in the way that Welsh just makes you understand these characters. There are so many times when you're reading a book where it's like, yeah, it's just a fictional character. They're doing their own thing. There's a story, and then it's over. You're reading Trainspotting. It's like, man, like these people have a past. They have a shared history. They have dreams. They have regrets. Like they feel, like you said, like real people.
I think the key to it as well is, I know you mentioned you didn't know much about Irvine Welsh, but the place where Trainspotting is set, he's from Leith, and Trainspotting feels like a very personal experience, probably because he was actually addicted to heroin for 18 months when it was kind of the punk scene in the 70s. So there's kind of I've done a couple of podcasts where I've spoken about punk bands before, mainly mine, but there is inherent correlation between sort of scenes and particular drugs. You know, in
Mm.
'70s it was heroin, and then you go to like Wall Street in the '80s where it was nothing but cocaine.
Mhm.
It's there are scenes that are responsible or responsive to certain substances, and that is what I think fundamentally Trainspotting has to it. It's a real understanding because Irvine Welsh has been there, and it's like you said, it's kind of an addictive process. It doesn't matter what the addiction is. It is sort of a fundamental understanding of the broader spectrum of what you can and can't be addicted to. I mean, it's I don't know if you remember this. I think this time last year I was working two full-time jobs on top of one another.
I do remember.
And obviously that was not healthy, and I had a pretty bad burnout afterwards. But I loved it. I really enjoyed it. I hated it at the time, but it's that kind of addiction to, well, I can do more and more and more. And
Mhm.
my sole focus for the past year has been sort of finding a balance. But there's something within me that where every other month I'm like, oh, I'm going to do this next big thing, and I do it, and it's like that rush is beyond anything else I've ever had. Or it was when I got the accreditation for Venice, my first thought was, great, what's next? It's like, I haven't even been there yet. You got to slow it down. But for some people, that's like the singular focus. The singular focus is, when's the next hit? When's that next high? Even before they've experienced the one that they're currently on. And you
Mhm.
see that, especially in the opening, where he tries to, rid himself. He tries to get clean. He goes to the worst toilet in the world. And after that, it's back to the flat. And then it ends, and you don't hear much about him coming off because he's had another hit. He's chased the high before he's even experienced the last one, and it's a real danger. And obviously, I mean, Irvine Welsh knows it better than me with writing Trainspotting. It's a real spiral, and seeing that spiral unfold at different paces is the most important thing, because addiction is not the same for everybody. Where it's, it could happen immediately for some people. The quickness of it with Tommy, for instance,
Oh
from how he
yes.
goes from very straight shooting, very, oh, I'm not going to do drugs, to pretty much dead um, by the time you get halfway through the book, compared to someone like Mother Superior, for instance, who, if I'm not mistaken, it's him or someone else loses a leg by the end of the book,
Yes.
and
Yes.
their usage as an addiction has gone on far longer than that of Tommy. But addiction does not care for time. It's a matter of how long someone can last on it. And a lot of Trainspotting is like that, and I think that really helps the realism of it, the real sort of bleakness to it. But even then, there's little sparks, there's little bits of hope where it's like, Renton's parents, for instance, were like, we're going to cold turkey, we're going to help you through this. It's like, there's always a network, there's always support there, and seeing that come through is really just, it adds that extra layer of real sort of vindication almost. It really adds that emotional level of, there are people out there that can help, and it's well mused on. But even then, those are sort of seem to be full of venom as well. When with the Ventus entry, which is, I remember it the first time. I remember finishing Trainspotting the first time. I was like, well, I can see why they cut that from the movie. And then the second time, I was like, mother of God, that is some of the most disturbing stuff I've ever read. But
Yeah.
it's the fact that there's no hint that it's, you know sort of I don't even know what the word for it is. There's no indication that this is not the truth until the character reveals it way, way down the line. You are, for a couple of pages, thinking, "Oh my God, there's somebody worse than Bigby here."
Yeah. That was definitely a highlight of my reading experience. You mentioned this earlier. There are, it's vignettes, it's episodic. That section, that chapter, it's a proper like banger short story,
Oh yeah,
because you're
oh yeah.
following it. I forget the protagonist's name of that segment. It's not Tommy, is it? It's the other one.
No, no. So it's two
Um,
people that are just kind of unconnected from everything else.
yeah, who
It just
are
happens.
they have HIV, AIDS,
Yeah,
and in this segment, or this person goes to the meetings for STDs and HIV positive people, and there he meets the absolute worst person in the world, like a
yeah,
proper shitbag. And there is a lot of frustration and anger amped up into this protagonist, because it's just like, yeah, all the people around here got AIDS from sex, most likely, and they think I also had it like that, but it wasn't. It was just a stupid coincidence, and that's how you get it, which is also something I really appreciate about Trainspotting, despite coming out a decade after those problems arose in the US, in England, the entire world. um, it does also demystify the entire thing of like, yeah, you don't just get AIDS from gay sex or sex in general, but just if you're a needle user,
Yeah.
and you go to these things and you share needles, it can be as simple as that, or even simpler with just spit. It can just be someone spitting in your mouth for whatever reason, and you're done for. Um, but this segment basically is just a vendetta that the protagonist has towards this man, this terrible, terrible man, and it goes to a very dark place. And I don't think I want to ruin what happens for people who are interested in actually reading the book if they haven't already, because this element is not present in the film, thank God. But it's dark. Like I was tempted to kind of drop the book for a second there, because it's like 40 pages this whole chapter, and I was like,
Oh, yeah.
fucking hell, I don't know if I can keep going, but also it cannot be like this, right? And it keeps going and going. More things are revealed. It's like, oh my God, like what am I reading? And it's like, okay, thankfully everything is fine at the end. Small spoiler, everything's fine. Doesn't end in a horrible way. It's kind of satisfying in its own messed up way. But that was when I was thinking, like, is this book too dark? Like, is this going to be too far? And in a way, I'd say no. I
Mm.
think Welsh manages to balance out the grimness of the realities of what it means to be, an addict, or just a working class individual in early 90s Scotland, completely forgotten by the UK. And it's just like, wow, the government doesn't care for us. We barely have any support financially to, kind of make something of ourselves. And the only thing you can actually do, like you mentioned, if you're a bumfuck nowhere, what do? You go to the pub or you do drugs. And that's the other thing. I'll say probably the last thing that really, really surprised me of the book, coming from the movie, which we'll talk about in a second, is it's so grounded. The
Yeah.
movie is it's very, very heightened. It feels like you're on a drug trip. It's very 90s,
Yeah.
but the book is very realistic. There's no fantasy, there's no dreams, and that makes all of the drama and even the humor, I'd say, hit much harder.
Yeah, I agree with that. And what's key to that as well is that grounded realism. And it's kind of when you said there, it's like, does it go too far? It's like, I work primarily sort of in journalism, and I do a lot of news. Stuff like that happens every day, and I know it does because I write it, and it happens pretty close to where I live. I mean, just today, I finished about an hour ago. A fake priest has swindled millions out of a church. A boy was dissolved in acid by a mafia gang. A
Wow.
family was shot to death. There's drugs everywhere, and it's not the fact that it's sort of centralized and always constant. It's because it's just happening, and Irvine Welsh is kind of, if anything, he's toned it down a bit. Um, it's really terrifying, and I think more and more I'm sort of aware of my own mortality, like Renton is, where it's like, what do you do? I'm 23. I shouldn't be asking that question, but what do you do? And it's like, is life just experience? Is that the whole prophetic meaning of it, just to experience things? And it might be, but for some, that is just to experience heroin, to choose that life rather than another. Which I think that's one of the big things as well. Actually, that choose life segment in the book is really short. It's about a paragraph. It's
Yeah.
done, and it's just to round out a chapter, and then it moves on. That's it. That's all you hear of it. But I think that just displays more of a sort of how the book managed to jump to the big screen and what you needed to do in the period of adapting those books. Because time and time again, people say Irving Welsh's books are just impossible to adapt. They did it for Filth. They did it for Trainspotting. It's not that they're unadaptable. It's just that they're so grim and they're so infused with what actually is going on. And there is proof of this going on, because every day something on the news is like train crash, plane crash, somebody's died, somebody's been shot, somebody's killed somebody else. It is pretty constant. It's that barrage that Welsh gets here, is that there's no real positivity in the book. And that's kind of because for these characters, there isn't. There are people out there that have none of that positivity. So to make it bleak and horrible and really articulate that horror, I think it's really, really powerful stuff. I'm excited to read the second one in that sort of grim fascination.
Yeah, especially given the title porno, I guess that goes to
Yeah,
some
and then
interesting places, probably.
Skag Boys as well.
The
After
Skag
that,
Boys, yeah.
yeah,
It's a whole universe, like you mentioned earlier.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
the Irvine Welsh literary universe
I hope they
of
do a
characters.
cinematic universe on the level of Marvel. You know,
Oh,
give Begbie a spin-off film. You know, the usual. God, I'd actually throw somebody into a wood chipper if that happened, like Fargo. Honestly,
This
I'd
is-
lose my mind.
well, they've tried it. I think when we did the episode on Fields, I think we found out there was like a TV show
Yeah,
of the
um,
sequel, spin-off sequel novel of
yeah.
Fields, something like that. But anyway,
Filth,
that's
Crime, and then he released another one, which is a sequel to
crime.
Crime, but I've not read it
Okay,
yet. I haven't got a clue. I'm going to buy it though, obviously, because you know,
he's
might as
fairly
well.
prolific. Bless him, bless him.
He is. He writes a bloody lot, which is great news for me because I feel like Irvine Welsh is one of those writers that I could just consistently read. I could read him again and again without a break. I'd be happy to just sit down and read his bibliography.
Yeah, it's
Is it
very fast
bibliography the
paced.
right word? Yeah.
Bibliography, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
But of course, Trainspotting was a success as a book. Kind of rocked and shook England when it came out. I was like, "Holy shit! What's happening in Scotland? Who's this Irvine Welsh guy?" And it became a little bit of a superstar in the literary circles.
Mm-hmm.
And rights were bought, and the movie was made by everyone's favorite director. I guess I don't know, Danny Boyle.
High
Uh,
praise.
High praise, high praise. No, but bless him. I really like Danny Boyle. And, in 1994, he made Shallow Grave, which was a bit of a cult hit. And he managed to showcase that with a very, very small budget, he could create something very inventive, very fast paced, engaging, darkly funny, mysterious. It was like, wow, look at this guy. And he managed to get the opportunity to direct Trainspotting, which was like the script of Trainspotting was written by John Hodge, who's a close friend and collaborator of Danny Boyle. And so it's Trainspotting 1996, starring Ewan McGregor as Renton, Ewan Bremer as Spud, Johnny Lee Miller as Sick Boy, and especially Robert Carlyle as Franco Bigby. What a cast.
Wow.
What a legendary film. Like this is one of those movies that is considered one of the best of all times, definitely one of the defining movies of the 90s, both in style and content as well. What are your thoughts, Ewan, of this best top 250 IMDb
Oh Jesus.
movies? One of the first, I think, on this
I'm
podcast.
so glad that we're doing Trainspotting because I'm actually named after Ewan McGregor because of this
Yes,
film. Which
such an
is
honor.
a weird link to name your child after a man that played a heroin addict, but that's okay. No, I'm of that generation. I was born in 1999, like at the back end of it, so I'm nostalgic for the era that had just came before me, which is why I'm
Mhm.
obsessed with Britpop and all that sort of thing. So Trainspotting is a perfect little time capsule for me, where it's a lot of themes, a lot of ideas, even though the story kind of feels like it's set a little before that. It feels a lot more modern than it should, especially considering it was made in 96, which is, decades ago now, which is mad. That's actually horrifying. But I love Trainspotting. I've watched it countless times. I've watched it ever since. I think it was one of, again, I always bring this up, it was one of the first reviews I ever did was Trainspotting. And I've got a lot of memories with
Amazing.
it, good and bad, where it's the people you watch it with, the sort of circumstances you watch it in, is just unbelievable. I remember feeling absolutely miserable and just completely sorry for myself at uni one time in first year, and I watched this, and I think I watched Guest House Paradiso as well, and that was my double bill for the night. And I just felt much better about myself. But Trainspotting is just, it's something else. It really is. I mean, not just for what it means to me personally, but what it meant for British film at the time in '96, where it's the films that followed it, stuff like the Full Monty, where it was so British, so important, and the stuff that preceded it was starting to get a new light as well. And it's no surprise that half the Trainspotting cast were in both of those films. Robert Carlyle was in Full Monty, and then Brassed Off, which came out a couple of years before, had Ewan McGregor in it. And it's it feels like that era where Mike Leigh and Ken Loach's type of films were popular. It feels like that
Yes.
scenario. And it makes sense because Naked had released in 92, and that felt like the starting point for something that had exploded. And then by 96, it hit its apex because Cool Britannia, which is what sort of the British music scene at the time was called, had sort of hit its hot streak where you had Pulp, Blur, Oasis, Suede, all that good stuff. A lot of them on the soundtrack of this because it's a very culturally relevant movie, and it's a testament to how quality that era of pop culture was that it's still relevant now. Because people look back on this film with real sort of love for the not the place, not the time or the characters, but the significance it had on British film at the time. It was that shift in gear that every sort of country's filmography needs. It was that next step. Such an important movie, but it's also arguably one of the best films ever made. Not just in England, but ever. It's phenomenal.
Wow.
Oh yeah, it's top 20 material.
Bold statements
Oh yeah,
thrown around here. Wow. This may be surprising, considering how many movies I've seen. This was only my second time watching it, and the first
Oh.
time I saw it was a couple of years ago. I for some reason it just took me so long to get around to Trainspotting. It's one of those films that you always hear about. Like I mentioned, you go on IMDb and the 1001 movies, like it's on all those lists. So it's like everyone knows it, everyone's seen it. But just simply by osmosis, most of the key scenes. The cold
Yeah.
turkey moment. The worst bathroom in Scotland. All those bits, but watching it both of these times, like a couple of years ago and revisiting it for this podcast, like, man, what a film. But most importantly, man, I miss young Danny Boyle. Danny Boyle in his first like 10 years, 10, 15 years, it's such an energy to him that I think has been lost for the
Yeah.
past decade or so, which is an absolute shame because I'm watching Trainspotting, and it's similarly to the drugs and the high that Rent Boy and the others are pursuing. It's intoxicating. It's such a short film. It's like 90 minutes long, and it moves like this,
Oh yeah.
like the good Jakob would say, because it never slows down. It's like a music video where you're just constantly transitioning from hyperactive scene to hyperactive scene. In one moment you're in a more tense situation with Bigby. In the next one, there's a poop joke basically. In another one, there's a sex scene. In another one, there's someone shooting up, and in another one, there's violence, and there is a chase. It's just you feel breathless by the end of it, but it feels so good. And that's something that I'm kind of wondering, because I would say that Trainspotting, together with Requiem for a Dream, which came out, I want to say, a couple of years later, maybe 2000, 2001,
Yeah, yeah.
they brought heavy drug culture into the mainstream, because beforehand you would only see it in like proper adult films. Like, they wouldn't be in something that millions of people would go out and watch and pay for and actually really love and enjoy. And I'm wondering, I want to ask you this because I'm still a bit conflicted about it. How do you feel that Trainspotting portrays the drug life, the drug use of these characters, considering how Danny Boyle's style is so energetic in a great way, because it feels good, like it's undeniable. The
Yeah.
sharp cinematography and the music that's constantly playing, you're just like, man, this is awesome. But then you're talking about, the drug addicts and shooting up and stuff. So,
I think, yeah, it's a really difficult sort of position to find yourself in, where it's the aim of Trainspotting is to showcase that addiction is something done through sort of habit, but also because it kind of, let's be fair, regardless of what you're addicted to, must on a fundamental feel good. It's like I mentioned earlier about chasing that high of careerism. That is a fundamental. That's, I mean, regardless of whether or not I'm doing it out of habit, I can sort of notify myself. It's like, oh, you've done something there, and it just feels better. So at the same time as, I wouldn't say glamorizes it, where it isn't something that looks appealing. He makes sure to balance it between there is clear enjoyment, because that has to be factored in. You can't
of course,
take
yeah.
the enjoyment out of it unless there's that. I mean, the enjoyment is taken out of it, but at the start, especially the sort of the first time we see Renton, where he just does look like he's in a state of complete euphoria. He's hit nirvana. Like, that is the best his life has ever gotten. You've got to show that to sort of weigh out the difficulty of actually coming off of an addiction, but also the difficulty of moving on, which by the end of the film he has. And if you don't sort of experience the highs of it, you don't get to experience the lows of it. You can't. I think Trainspotting balances it. I think it has a really balanced palette. A lot of that comes through the subplots and the character development that comes around Renton and that sort of four-piece that's made present. I think Tommy's probably the best example of that, of how quick the fall is. But even then, there is stuff that happens to Sick Boy, to Spud, to Begbie, and to Renton especially, where we are shown something absolutely horrible, but to them it doesn't really matter because they're a bit preoccupied with something else. But we know that is not a correct way to live. Almost, that's not fundamentally what somebody should do with their lives. I think it balances it. I think it's acceptable how it does it. As far as how it went for the drug culture in the 90s, I mean, in music especially, heroin was pretty prevalent at that time as well, as was cocaine, as was pretty much every drug. But there was, I can't remember the guy's name, but there used to be a guy that would take Oasis a bag of drugs to every gig they went to, and he would just sort of storm through the crowd with a bag of drugs. He wrote a book about it a couple of years back. But I mean, it was prevalent. Everybody was sort of battling addiction. Damon Albarn, infamously, he spoke about his heroin addiction in the 90s. Graham Coxon was an alcoholic. Jarvis Cocker, I believe, has spoken about it. There are a lot of, at the time where people are talking about drug addiction, it was also going on in the scene. It felt very reflective, apart from if you Noel Gallagher, who, when asked to contribute to the soundtrack of Trainspotting, said, "No, we won't be doing that. I don't want to soundtrack something about fucking train spotters." He literally thought it was a film about people watching trains.
Talk about doing your research.
Mind you, speaking of research, I mean, today his new song came out. I really don't like Oasis, but he's released a solo song. He once infamously said, "Reading fiction is, quote, a waste of fucking time," end quote. So, I mean, all to play for. But
Probably
yeah,
has a
as
copy
far
of
as,
Spare on his nightstand right now.
oh, without a doubt.
Gotta love
But yeah,
non-fiction.
only non-fiction for Big Brain Noel, who once wrote the lyrics, "Slowly walking down a hall, faster than a cannonball." Don't know how that
I wonder
works,
if he
but
has
all right,
like a whole library of just soccer players' biographies.
I like to think it's that, and then he's got about 7 books on Plato. I think that'd be beautiful, wouldn't it?
Balance things out.
Yeah,
A
yin
little
yang.
bit of
But yeah,
philosophy.
as far as, sorry, I had to go off on a tangent to slag Noel Gallagher off. But as far as the sort of
I love it.
representation of the drug culture of the 90s goes, I'd say Boyle does a really good job of making sure that nobody's sort of glamorizing it. Nobody's going to watch Trainspotting and think, "Oh yeah, I could go for a bit of that." Yeah, delightful. I think it's really keen to not demonstrate it as something that should be engaged with.
Especially because everything is so dirty. It's just ugly. It's this dimly lit apartments with barely any furniture or appealing qualities to them. Like houses are literally just a place to crash.
Yeah. Oh,
Especially
exactly
Mother
that.
Superior's place, which isn't too heavily described in the book. And here you're just watching. It's like Jesus, just
Yeah.
dust everywhere, cobwebs on the wall and between doorways. It's like it's definitely a very visual experience as well.
Yeah.
That's just the beauty of early Danny Boyle. It was all about style, so much style. But even with the characters, they are much more likable. I wouldn't say they're necessarily likable in the book. Um,
Yeah.
you feel for them, you understand them, but I wouldn't necessarily say they are likable. Some of them, I think, like Sick Boy is a perfect example in the book because I didn't like him at all in the book. There's one scene that they kind of replicate and change it up a bit in the film, where in the book it's just him taking aim at this one skinhead who's bringing around a pit bull. He just shoots the pit bull so that the pit bull attacks the skinhead, and while the skinhead is being basically mauled by his own dog, uh, Sick Boy can just arrive and beat him to death, like the dog, of course, not the actual skinhead, the Nazi. But I was like, Jesus, like he's venting out his frustration with everything that happened before, in the story. But there's so much violence, so much anger. It's like, fuck me. Like, it's very hard to get behind him. And meanwhile, it's
Yeah.
just, talking to Sean Connery in his head, which is a bit of a running gag. But in the film, you have Johnny Lee Miller is already charismatic. I'd say the entire cast is incredibly charismatic. Just as soon as they're on screen, it's like, oh yeah, I can get behind them. Uh, and he's talking shit about, oh, the best James Bond is blah blah blah, and from Russia with love. So it's much more enjoyable. Even the scene where he's shooting at the dog, it's very early on in the story. It's him with Renton, and it's I think it's the small changes that manage to make. I think those are the changes that make the film a success, and it
Yeah.
actually had me thinking about Filth,
Mm.
because when we talked about Filth, the movie, I remember saying, like, this is still, it's not as gnarly as the book in some parts, but it's still going for it in a way that is very uncomfortable, and maybe that's why it wasn't a success. And rewatching Trainspotting after this, like, yes, like I saw this with my family. I was like, let's just try it out, let's see what happens. And outside of some of the pooping and puking, which just I'm sorry, mom, I'm sorry, sister, it's not pleasant for you to watch. But everything else, they got behind it. Like, they had a
Yeah.
blast. They found it very entertaining. The various themes, blah blah blah. And that's I mean, that just embodies everything. Like, it's a very fun film. It's sanitized enough to not be too uncomfortable to watch. Which, some elements that are very disturbing in the book, or just very legal, are a bit downplayed in the film. I think
Yeah.
everything with Kelly MacDonald's character, Diane,
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
it's very light, it's very fun, it's borderline romantic the way it's presented in the film, and the way her character keeps coming back as she's just exchanging letters with Renton.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, in the book, she's another one of those characters, I want to say maybe two chapters at most, and everything is kind of leading up to the reveal of, oh shit, he slept with a 14-year-old, and that's fucking illegal.
Yeah.
And he shouldn't be doing that, and that's it. It's like it stops. So it's all those changes that I would say are primarily for the better in terms of just an enjoyable experience. But
Yeah. I agree. It's amazing how kind of broadly aware people are of train spotting, given how grim, even after sanitization, the subject matter really is.
yeah.
And I think part of that has to do with the caliber of actors involved and what they went on to do. I mean, if you look at Ewan McGregor, who went on to play Obi-Wan Kenobi, he went on to do this and that and Moulin Rouge, and he did all
Christopher
sorts.
Robin.
Christopher Robin, can you imagine Renton from Trainspotting and Christopher Robin? It's the fact that it's one of those lucky sort of aspects of all four of the main characters, as well as some of the supporting actors, went on for really strong careers after Trainspotting. There's a longevity there where everybody sees them in other things. You see Johnny Lee Miller in something like Elementary, that TV show adaptation of Sherlock Holmes he did, or you see Ewan
Oh
Bremner pop up
yeah.
in Snowpiercer, and you think, oh yeah, they did Trainspotting, and then you go back to Trainspotting, but I think it's the cultural time capsule that Trainspotting is, where it does capture a segment of culture that a lot of people, especially my age, who kind of just missed out on it, are very nostalgic for. And it's amazing how much of it is at the same time very sanitized, is still really grim. And it does play into the fantasy elements. I think that's kind of how they get away with it, like the worst toilet in Scotland or in the world, or whichever one it is. When he, putting his hand in, puking, of thankfully like chocolate and not real shit. But to get away with that, he dives straight into the toilet. He's in the ocean. It
Stunning.
creates a bigger scene. It's the same for the scene where he goes cold turkey, which honest to God, the first time I saw the clip, I thought it was somebody just shown me it, like the baby turning his head. I thought it was genuinely like a clip from The Exorcist.
Yes.
I'd not seen either at the time, and I just thought, oh bloody hell, I'm not going to watch that anytime soon. Surprise, surprise, when I watched Trainspotting, that showed up. But it's the fantasy elements that kind of give it that tongue-in-cheek type of charm of, oh yeah, this is horrible, but it's kind of funny. When he's under the covers and Bugby is just there under there with him, and then he pulls it up, and then Sick Boy's there, and it's the pacing of it I think matters most, where they don't spend too long on the horrible aspects of it. Heroin is very much the fundamental sort of core to this group of people, kind of used very sparingly. It's more the sort of chase rather than the action that is sort of considered most of all. And then by the end of the film, it's one of those things that people, especially in the audience, have gotten used to. They're kind of used to seeing Renton take heroin, but at that point, they're as bored of it as he is, and that's
Mhm.
that's the eclipse. That's the end of the circle. It it doesn't go on, but it's an understanding that that's the final part.
That's a great point. Actually, it makes me think of when I remember when The Wolf of Wall Street came out, and a lot of people were criticizing it in my area because it's so long, and all of the debauchery gets old after a while. It's like, yes, that's the point. Trainspotting does the same thing except in half its runtime. Just, but it's true. Like, you're completely right. Even the fact that you follow Renton, and that's actually another thing I didn't focus too much on, but you follow Renton. Like,
Yeah,
Ewan McGregor is the protagonist. You do cut away to some of the other characters a couple of times here and there, but changing the perspective, not from a God's eye view where you're just popping in different people's viewpoint of like, it's Renton Spud and blah blah blah. You're just following the one character and everyone surrounding him. It also makes it a much tighter experience. Like, there are so many fun vignettes in the book. There's one that really stuck out to me. We were following some waitresses in a restaurant that are so annoyed at the misogynistic behavior of some of the customers that they just start doing some very nasty things to their food, in an escalation of meanness. But again, where would you put it in this film? It doesn't fit, in
yeah,
terms of content context. Um, Even some of the things that Renton himself goes through, I found them very interesting. There's this whole element in the novel about him being kind of bisexual or open to other sexual experiences, where
yes, yeah,
he's in London and he goes to a porno theater and he befriends one of the patrons who's trying to sleep with him. It's this bizarre friendship that they form, but all of those elements are kind of removed to have a more focused narrative, which again works really really well. um, but it's so once you get to London, and similarly to the book, when you see him is doing where he's showing the apartments to the people, it's like, man, he likes it, and we're liking it. It's like, this is nice, this is comfy, it's cool, and he's digging it. But then when his friends come over and completely take over his life again, like, you do feel the need to just detach himself from them completely, to close it off. Which is why, in a weird way, I kind of see Trainspotting the film as much a film about addiction, of course, as the source material, but also a film about just friendships and why sometimes they have to end,
yeah,
which is not an easy thing at all. And that's something that has always been very, important to me in a way. I've moved around multiple times. I've lived in 6 cities in 13 years of my life. So you get used to say goodbye to people, and there's just something about finally finding someone that you can kind of, you really enjoy them, you like to spend time with them, you're like, yeah, I've some those friends, and then being forced to kind of, I kind of need to close things off. This cannot keep going on.
yeah,
Um, that's another element, even in the film and the book as well, that I forgot to mention. Uh, the self awareness of just how mean someone like Bigby is, because Bigby doesn't do drugs. Bigby is borderline an alcoholic, but especially is just addicted to violence. He
yeah,
finds any excuse in the world to just punch someone. He's going to create a situation, a very weird scenario, just to have an excuse to start a bar fight or to stab someone or threaten them or whatever. And you have Renton and the other guys are like, why do we even spend time with him? Oh yeah, because we're scared of him. Like, we gotta really close this off because otherwise he's gonna stab us. Um, and it's this element of just, some friendships are just unhealthy and
yeah,
you need to close them off. And I think the way the movie is shot and made, which is way way funnier than anything in the book, I'd say, just it's a proper comedy, dark comedy. um but the culmination of it all, like, speaking of the ending, it's so satisfying. No, it just feels so good to see Renton. Yeah, disappointing, sick boy. I'm leaving some money for
yeah.
Spud, but fuck Big thing.
The thing as well, it's that ending. It's where he's smiling. He's got the bag, and it's the future is anything that he makes of it. I know for a fact that's how I'll feel when I leave this town. I'm just attached to that feeling.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the most important thing for me. And I think it's why I do a lot of work as well, where it's like that feeling is really good. And to replace it's very difficult. And I think the only thing you can do to replace that is to have a clean break, as clean as Renton's. It's like you said, when you sort of think about friendships that just kind of have reached a natural end or a point where an impasse is there, a lot of the time you don't really know until something sort of fundamentally different happens.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a strange one to process, but I think Trainspotting does it very well. Of eventually you outgrow people, eventually people outgrow you, and I think it's done with such care that it kind of just comes very naturally to Trainspotting. It's like the book. It has that quality of an understanding perception, an understanding quality of, eventually you got to move on. You got to move on from an addiction or a person or a sort of something that's happened. You get a set limit of time you're allowed to spend thinking about something, and then you've got to give it up. I don't think it's allowed to be triple the amount of time that you actually spent with someone or something. I think at that point you've got to stop.
Yeah.
But no, I think Danny Boyle does an excellent job of making it sort of quite clear that it is difficult.
Mm.
It also feels like this is one of the films where it's actually captured what he wants to do as a director. Because obviously after this he did Sunshine, and then he did, I
28
think where he
Days
lost.
Later.
28 Days Later feels a bit sort of more creative, where he's
Mm-hmm.
on the streets of London. And then it's like his sort of, I don't like the term Hollywood era, but it is like Slumdog Millionaire and 127 Hours, where it's
Yeah.
not his direction. Anybody could have done those two films. And then he kind of tries to reignite it with, I think it was, what was it called? I've forgotten what it's called now.
Trance?
Yeah, with James McAvoy. And it feels like, oh, I'm going to get back to my roots. And it doesn't really work. So he's like, oh, I'll go the other direction. He starts doing stuff like Yesterday. And he hasn't found that sort of footing again, which is a real shame. He did in Trainspotting too, but even then that feels like such a fundamentally different film of it. For all it's brilliant, and I really, really like the second film, it still feels a bit sterilized in that Danny Boyle post-90s way.
Yes, I managed to watch Trainspotting 2 for the first time recently, and that's actually another reason why I didn't watch the first movie. I remember the second one coming out, and that's when I was taking
Yeah.
a history of cinema class, and some of the other students were not big fans of it. And they were, to be fair, this was also a very snobbish crowd where you have to prove yourself to be superior to the mainstream cinema. And so they were shitting a lot on the original movies. Were like, yeah, I never liked this, fuck it. Screw you, Danny Boyle.
I don't
Which
think
is
there's
unfair.
any better indicator of bad taste other than, oh, I don't like Trainspotting. As soon as you said that, I have no interest in what else you have to say. Because there are just some fundamentals in film. There are, if you don't like it, at least appreciate it. I think Trainspotting is one of those that has the sort of, it's the perfect lightning in a bottle situation where it's hard to dislike it. Even if you disagree with what's going on as a subject, there is more than enough there in technical quality, in writing, in style, more than enough to enjoy it. And I do not believe people that say they don't like Trainspotting. It makes me very suspicious of them.
Yeah, I don't trust him. I don't even trust him now after, I mean, I trust him less. Now that I've also seen the sequel, because I did enjoy it. I think, like you said, there's just something odd about the way it's made.
Yeah.
It has occasional sparks of the old Danny Boyle, where he places the camera in some interesting positions, like on top of a microphone as Ewan McGregor sings, and it keeps swaying from him
Yeah.
to the crowd. Those are cool shots, but also it's excessively digital in a way that's ugly. There are a lot of night shots where there's just this
Yeah.
odd motion blur. When I was watching, I was like, what? It keeps changing from camera to camera. You can tell those are different cameras during certain shots. Like, what? It's all
It's the
those small
handheld camera
details.
shots as well in the crowds, and it was just, what does
It's
that really
odd.
add, that perspective? I'm not sure.
Yeah, none of the music. Like, fuck me, we haven't really talked about the music, but the
No, yeah.
soundtrack of the original is insane.
I've got it on
It's
CD. It's one of the two soundtracks I own on CD. The other one's Reservoir Dogs, but
another
I remember
banger
finding
soundtrack.
it in Poundland. And I thought, oh
Wow.
wow, the Trainspotting soundtrack, brilliant. And I bought it because it had Mile End on by Pulp, which I think is one of their greatest deep cuts. But
Yeah.
Trainspotting's impact kind of, we've spoken about the impact it had on Irvine Welsh and the culture and sort of film, but it had a lot of impact for Iggy Pop as well, who at the time really had no form of sort of mainstream career. And then Danny Boyle comes along saying, "Hey, do you want to do a new music video?" And there you go. He's back in the mainstream.
It
And
is
it was the
name
same for
dropped
Lou
multiple
Reed.
times in the film as well.
Oh yeah, because to be fair, I think obviously Iggy Pop's early works and sort of his history with David Bowie in the early '70s and the mid '70s as well, fundamentally was about addiction, heroin, all sorts of horrible substances. But he felt connected to that area. It's amazing which artists you can connect with despite being from completely different backgrounds, but there is always a fundamental that connects two people together.
Mm-hmm.
For Iggy Pop, it was the music and also the sort of the backstory behind him for people in Trainspotting.
Yeah.
But beyond that as well, the soundtrack is phenomenal. Man, unbelievable. Some of my favourite songs on there. Some of my favourite bands as well. You got Blur, you got Pulp. Unbelievable, like ridiculous. And then even the second soundtrack, I know it's not spoken about too much, but the sequel soundtrack's really good. You've got the Prodigy remixing Iggy Pop. I can't remember the name of the song that opens the film. It's got the word shotgun in it though. I'm trying to find it. A shotgun mouthwash, high contrast, incredible. When he's on the treadmill, unbelievable song. But then there's stuff where it's the first Trainspotting film was really integral to capturing the zeitgeist. I hate the word zeitgeist, but it's the only word for it. It's capturing that bit. Don't tell people I've said the word zeitgeist. Capturing the culture of the 1990s, what was fundamentally important at the time. And I think Trainspotting 2 does that successfully as well, because you've got stuff like Run DMC, you've got Wolf Alice, Young Fathers, you've got contemporary artists at the core yet again. And it's so important because the change in tone is that what we've just spoken about, finding a new addiction to move on from an old one. You've got Spud with the writing, you've got Renton with the running, and it all feels like a real payoff. And I love the second film as much as I do the first film, but it's because it tackles different beasts. It's fundamentally moved on from the heroin. Like heroin's briefly in it,
Yeah.
but it's all about addiction, because I think addiction goes beyond addiction to something. I think it can be addiction of with. It can be really broad, and that's the horrifying thing about it. And I think that's what Trainspotting does really well, is that it gets to grips with it's not enough to move on from one addiction. You've got to move on to another one to really move on from something, which is difficult. It's really, really terrifying.
Yeah, it's a very good film. I'd recommend it to people if they haven't watched it already. I know it's a bit controversial. There's a lot of mixed reception. I had some comments as well on my review where people like saying, it stinks. This film stinks. It's not nearly as, at least for me, it's not nearly as memorable as the first one.
Yeah.
It's even a bit uneven. It's way too long for its own good. I think if it were a bit more tightly paced, but also like you mentioned, I do appreciate that it has a different style, because it couldn't be as manic as the original. Because it's like you said, it's different addictions, different drugs that they are becoming involved with. But yeah, it's a very, very good film.
Yes.
But it's no Trainspotting one.
No,
I know some
no.
people. I know a couple people that I follow on Letterboxd love the sequel more than the original. Bless you. I love that you do that, but
I can see why. I mean, it's the
very
first film's
nostalgic,
about,
very, very mature as well.
The first film's sort of tackling addiction. The second film is about tackling the midlife crisis that comes after a choice. You've got Renton, who's not touched heroin in 20 years. All roads lead to your origins, which is terrifying, because there's one point, whether it's 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now, you will at some point find yourself back where you were, which is really the most haunting part of these two films. Really is actually keeps me up at night sometimes.
That's
terrible stuff, eh? Really else. What did you do that for?
We brought the mood down. No, but it's true. It's something that I see from a lot of people. I mean, even I personally, it's not in that long of a span, thankfully. But still, I had to come back to my hometown after leaving it for a while, and there's always the feeling, and that's something that I do appreciate a lot about the messages of the sequel. There's always the feeling that you're kind of a failure if you do that. I have a friend of mine who's doing everything in his power to not come back here. because he's afraid he's going to be seen as a failure, which makes me wonder if he sees me and other people who've done that as failures as well. But again, the idea of being a disappointment, and you have that with Frenton who comes back and he's just, oh no, I have a wife, I have children, everything's amazing in Amsterdam. I'm just saying for a couple of days, like, nope, nope, you're getting a divorce and
Yeah.
life's changing and you have to come back home. But that's all right as well. That's something that I do appreciate, is that ultimately
Oh
that's
yeah.
good, as long as you're feeling good about it, as long as you manage to find your own rhythm, what makes you feel good, and when you have healthy addictions like
I
running,
think yeah,
or good
it says a
friends.
lot about the sort of social perspective that people have as well. I mean, especially for me, when I moved back home after uni, it wasn't because I didn't have a job. It was because you can't just buy a house straight away. So I, to some degree, feel like a failure that I'm back home because my trajectory, I saw myself uni and then straight away into a full-time job. But that's not life. That's not life anymore.
Mhm.
And it still disappoints me. And I think that's why cabin fever's set in, and I'm actually going feral. I'm so glad this isn't a video podcast. I look like I've lost the fucking plot. But a broad problem for it is that to head back home or to sort of regress almost, it does feel like a failure. But sometimes it's to step forwards. You sort of take stock, you give yourself time to breathe, and then move on to the next step. I know, I mean, we spoke about it before the podcast. There's not a chance in hell I'll be moving out this year. But that's stuff out of my control. It's not
Yeah.
within my power to change things. That's not a failure on my part, but it is a disappointment that will then feed a disappointment and a failure feeling that was there before. It's a horrible addiction. It really is adapted really well in Trainspotting and in my own life.
Yeah. It's a powerful story, and I think maybe
Mm.
that's ultimately why it's so popular, both the book and the film, is that it's relatable. You wouldn't think that just
Yeah.
by looking at the synopsis. Like, well, how can I relate as an upper class, middle class, upstanding citizen? How can I relate to junkies? It's like, well, we're all human after all.
Yeah.
We're all just blood and
These yeah.
sweat and water and poop.
A lot of it in some instances.
There's a lot of it in
Oh yeah.
this story.
But I think it's rather telling that some of the most well-rounded, interesting, relatable characters that I've come across in film and in reading are heroin addicts.
Mm.
I don't know what that says about me, but it really does say a lot about the talent that goes behind not just writing these characters, but bringing them to life.
Yes, yes. Amen. Amen to that. On this note, Johan, I have one last question for
Oh
you.
shit!
At
Oh
the end of
no,
the
I'm thinking of
day,
the other
after
question.
after no, no, not that request. At the end of the day, after this conversation on train spotting, which version do you like best? Irvine Welsh's book or Danny Boyle's film?
Ah, fuck. You know what? I really don't know. I hadn't thought about it until you just asked me there. Um, I'm gonna say the film. I'm gonna go
Okay.
with the film. Yeah, I think for me, it's not just the sort of adaptation per
Mhm.
se. It really does get to the core fundamentals of Irvine Welsh's writing on Trainspotting. It sacrifices a lot,
Mm.
but it kind of made up for in the sequel. It sacrifices the sectarianism commentary. It sacrifices some of the characters. It sacrifices some of the sort of bolder scenarios that are found in the book. The offset of that is one of, if not the most culturally relevant film Britain has ever done. I do think it's the best thing that this country has produced, not just in film, but in general. One of the top three of all time that this country has ever done. And it will
Together with the
never do
Beatles
that
and
again.
James Bond.
No. No. Train Spotting,
Harry
Pulp, and
Potter.
me. Harry Potter,
Uh,
Jesus. When are we doing that for Death by Adaptation? Just a stretch of 8. Perfect. We'll do the stage play.
kill
No,
me.
I think the film is better. I'm going to also use the defense of when I first read this, I had the film on 5 stars and the book on 4. So I'm going to use that as a really shaky defense
Yeah, that's very fair.
of both have gotten better, but the film has gotten betterer.
Yeah,
That'll do.
that's very, very fair. I'm also interested in reading the sequel book because one of the things I appreciated about the film, you mentioned it as well, is that it actually implements elements that were cut from the first book, especially everything with Spile that he starts picks up writing as a hobby and as a way to
Yeah,
kind of process things. There are actual parts from the book from his perspective that are just implemented, especially like Bigby finding
yeah,
his father on just pacing around, not recognizing his son. That was one of the more
yeah.
sad, just sad parts that highlight so much about Bigby as a character in the book, which was missing from the
In the
original film. He's
film,
more of
yes.
almost a cartoonish villain, you could say, in a way that works, but you don't see a lot of humanity in him necessarily.
Yeah.
Robert Carlyle, bless him, but in the sequel they do add those elements back in. So yeah, it's a good
Yeah.
reason.
And it's amazing as well how that, I mean, the shift, I mean, I feel like everybody sort of says they identify with a character,
Hmm.
but it's not the character you're identifying with, it's the ideas that they express. And it's mad that from the first film of I've got to get away, that sort of Renton perspective shifts towards what Spud is going through in the second film, where it's like, you have got to find an addiction, you've got to find a hobby, you've got to find something that you are good at that you can do constantly. And it just so happens that Spuds is writing, and that's it, kind of the start that I got. I just started doing it as a hobby, and now it's this, now it's a job,
Hmm.
and it's that addictive quality, and it's very personal. It's very strange how a film can sort of just pop that together. It's very very weird feeling.
Yeah, yeah. I, I don't really know which one I would pick. You know what? I'll agree with you on this one. I'll agree with you. I'll go with the film because I think it manages to ultimately give you the same ideas, same messages, same themes as the book. It's far less uncomfortable, even
Yeah.
though I do appreciate a lot of the darkness that Irvine Welsh goes to. But also, the book doesn't have one of the best uses of perfect day.
Oh yeah.
That entire sequence of Rent, like I was rewatching the film, that's when I was like, yeah, there's a reason why I'm adding this to my all-time favorites list.
Yeah.
It's just Renton completely like sucked into and lost in this drug haze, and seeing everything from basically a carpet it's just being carried around, and Lou Reed is singing. Ah,
Yeah.
I was like, that's
I mean,
cinema.
I never used to be a fan of Lou Reed and Velvet Underground. I'll not give too much away because we're about to go and do a recording of
Oh
that for mine.
shit!
But it was that scene when I watched it this time round, and I've seen Trainspotting probably about, I don't know, 14 times. I don't really keep count. Letterboxd says I've seen it about 7, but I deleted a few entries, so it might be less. Because I've reviewed this film about 4 times now, and I've only just gotten a draft that I'm happy with.
Nice.
Um, but it's a beautiful song, Perfect Day. I don't care. I think I've gone from being tepid on Lou Reed to just really liking his style and his prose and his character that comes through, and using it on a scene that has Renton sort of wrapped up in a carpet being carried
Mhm.
into a taxi by Mother Superior is, it's beautiful. Really is stunning. Something else.
With his head just banging around the song is kind of funny. But
That's the
yes.
thing. Everybody's been in that situation or has seen that situation unravel, whether it's drugs or drink. Somebody's been in that state before. I've been in that state before with drink, but
Just totally
it's
wasted.
seeing it from a different perspective that is kind of very jarring and very eye opening. It's haunting,
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, amazing, amazing.
funny as well to some degree,
Very funny.
because
Very, very funny.
you know that you'll look like that to other people when you're clutching a microphone doing karaoke after several shots of Jaeger.
The memories, the memories. And yet, unfortunately, we are at the end of this episode of the Death by Adaptation podcast. Of course, everyone definitely check out both Trainspotting novel and film if you can. Easily available, and it's well worth a watch and a read. Ewan, where can
Hello.
our listeners find you on social media?
I'm prepared this time. I've actually managed to
Hey,
get my list up. You can find me on Twitter and Letterboxd at Ewan Gleadow, EWANGLEADOW. And you can get all my work on Cult Following, Daily Star, a couple other
rethinking.
places. Now I'm all over the joint. I've got my own
Yes.
podcast. Don't listen to this, which you can get on Twitter, DLTT Pod. Um, me and Nick are literally about to go and record an episode of that on the Velvet Underground's
Yes.
self-titled third album, which I'm very much looking forward to.
Get hyped.
But I've had some different guests on there recently. I've had the pianist from the Savoy in London. I've had a producer of a film score from a Timothy Spall movie. I've had a couple
Ooh.
of cool bits and pieces on there. I've had a lovely pal of mine that works at the BBC. I've had obviously Nick. I've had all sorts of people on there. If you'd like to get involved, just give me an email because I'm running out of guests rather rapidly. I've got a recording with Carson on the 4th of February, so I'm panicking, thinking, how am I going to schedule episodes out until then? So we're doing one today. I've got another one tomorrow. I've got another one on Saturday. It's like I've got to start stacking these up.
Hectic life.
Me.
Amazing. Yeah, definitely check out Don't Listen to This pod, which it is indeed a fun time. And very, very short episodes as well, which is always fun. It's not nearly as long as my show or others. But of course, you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at NickyGran97. There you can find links to everything, links to my YouTube, Vimeo, letterbox reviews, articles on clapperltd.co.uk. And of course, you can follow this podcast, Death by Adaptation, on Twitter and Instagram, respectively, Death Adaptation and Death by Adaptation Pod. Stay tuned because we're entering the second edition of probably what's going to be my favorite thing about this entire podcast, which is a Valentine's Day special. Last year, we talked about 50 Shades of Grey, the entire trilogy, which was a goldmine of amazing quotes and just a bonding experience for me, Ewan, and the good Carson Tamar.
I'll just let you in on something about that. My dad loves the Trainspotting movies. And do you remember the channel E4 on UK TV?
I don't.
They just did a broadcast of all of them, like a marathon that started at 1 p.m. and ended at 3 a.m. We watched them all. I watched none of them because I've not time.
Of the 50 Shades or Trainspotting?
Twilight.
Oh, Twilight.
Twilight, yeah.
Yeah, because what we're talking about is Twilight.
Sorry, I plucked out and I was like, he's mentioned it already. Trying to just click my brain off.
Trainspotting? No, wait. 50 Shades? No, wait. Twilight? Yes, we're talking about Twilight special episode. Carson Tamar is joining us again. Hopefully he can make it. And also other special guests. Hilary White will be there to bring some very, very interesting insight on Stephanie Meyer and Edward and Bella's lovely, totally healthy, loving relationship. So stay tuned for that. We hope to see you there. We hope to see you for future episodes as well. Have a great day. Bye-bye.